This is the second video of section 7.3 about increasing the money supply. So let's go back and recap quickly. There are three main ways of increasing the money supply: printing notes, quantitative easing, or the credit creation process. So we've done the first two. And what I indicated previously was if the money supply is increased by the central bank printing notes, then it's the central bank doing that. If the money supply is increased through quantitative easing, it's the central bank doing that. This last one, which we're going to explore in this video, called the credit creation process, it's not the central bank that creates this process or makes this process occur, it's the banking system. So it's the ANZ Bank, Westpac, Commonwealth that actually facilitate this credit creation process. So in that sense, number 3 is quite different from numbers 1 and 2. Numbers 1 and 2 are controlled by the central bank. Number 3 is controlled by the commercial banks. Like commercial banks, I mean ANZ, Westpac, that sort of thing. So to understand what's going on here, let's have a look at this credit creation process and how it works. So what I'm going to do to explain this credit creation process to you is consider the injection of an additional $10 billion into the economy by the central bank. And that injection of $10 billion into the economy by the central bank will then trigger this credit creation process. Okay, so we've got two parts of this explanation. First of all, the central bank moving $10 billion additional dollars into the economy. And then that's not part of the credit creation process. But then once the $10 billion of new money is in the economy, then the credit creation process will start after that. That's an important, reasonably important distinction. So if you read about the credit creation process, you will, in the textbooks, you'll get sort of complex explanations about the monetary base equaling currency plus bank reserves, and it all gets very confusing very quickly. And it's hard to, I think the textbook explanation of this credit creation process, sometimes you get so bogged down in the theory and the complexity of the explanation in textbooks that it's really hard to fully appreciate what it's all about. It's just so complex. It's hard to sort of take a step back and fully appreciate what it really means. So what I'm going to do is simplify this explanation, this credit creation process, kind of give you more of an intuitive explanation, because ultimately what we're interested in this course is not understanding the credit creation process from a theoretical perspective. That doesn't interest me at all. What I'm more interested in is understanding at a very high level or a very simple level what the credit creation process is about, and then take that understanding and look at countries around the world that have experienced this credit creation process and look at how the process can be controlled and what sort of problems the process can actually create. Of course, I'm talking about a process that I haven't actually explained yet. So let's get stuck straight into the credit creation process. The first part is we need to assume that the central bank is injecting some new money into the economy. Now, don't worry about why they may be doing that. They're just doing it. Okay, let's not get distracted by things such as why are they doing this? We're trying to get to an understanding of this process, so let's not get distracted by questions like that at the moment. So they are injecting $10 billion into the economy. So if the central bank wants to push $10 billion of new money into the economy, how are they going to do that? Well, I guess one option would be to print $10 billion worth of new currency, fly over capital cities and just release it. Let it flutter down, people get that money and off they go. You could hand the money out. The central bank could go along and hand to perhaps people who've been unfortunate in life in Australia, hand cash out. They could do that, but they generally don't do it that way. It's a little bit clumsy. It's difficult to do it that way. what they tend to do is inject money into the economy by buying bonds. So we know what bond markets are about now, and you'll probably now begin to appreciate why we went through bond markets. So they're going to buy bonds. So let's just keep it really simple. Let's just imagine that there is a rich individual somewhere in Australia, and they are holding real estate and shares and all of these other assets, but they're also holding $10 billion worth of bonds that they've invested in. Now, the central bank comes along to that individual and offers to buy those bonds for $10 billion. And the rich individual agrees to that. So what's going to happen graphically or visually is what I've got down here. It's a bond buying, a bond purchase by the central bank. So the ownership of the bonds will flow from that rich individual into the central bank. And the bank will now hold those bonds as an asset on their balance sheet. But of course, that rich individual will want to be paid for those bonds. And so the central bank will then have to pay $10 billion to that rich individual. And that rich individual, let's assume that the rich individual banks with, let's make up a bank, ANZ. Okay, go alphabetically. ANZ. And so what the central bank will then do is transfer $10 billion into the exchange settlement account of the ANZ bank. And then at the same time, the ANZ bank will credit that rich individual's bank account with $10 billion. So the rich person will have $10 billion in their bank account, but the bank will have the $10 billion available for use in a sense. So let's assume that the rich person decides not to spend any of that $10 billion. In a sense, that $10 billion is in that person's bank account. Now, the way the banking system works is the bank will probably be paying interest to that person on the $10 billion. And so what the bank is going to want to do is then lend, if that person is not going to spend the $10 billion, the bank is going to want to lend that $10 billion out to another customer. This is how modern banking works. And as they lend that $10 billion out to another customer, they will charge that customer interest, and that interest can be used to pay the rich individual interest on their $10 billion in their savings account. And there'll be a difference in the interest rates so that the bank makes profit out of this. Okay, so what we've got, the rich individual has $10 billion in their bank account, but that is new money. That is money that has come from the central bank that was not part of the economy before. It's just $10 billion worth of new money. So we go to the second slide. We've gone through steps 1 and 2 and 3, actually. So the central bank conducts an open market operation. An open market operation is just a fancy term for the central bank buying and selling bonds. In this case, it purchased a bond because we wanted to consider money being injected into the economy. If the central bank sold a bond, it would be taking money out of the economy. Both of those called open market operations. So the central bank has conducted an open market operation of a bond purchase of $10 billion. That has pushed $10 billion into this rich person's bank account. So the bank, in a sense, now has $10 billion of reserves or reserve cash. And we have $10 billion worth of new money. So what's the bank going to do? Well, it's going to lend out some of this 10 billion. Now I'm keeping it simple here. So I am assuming that the bank doesn't lend out all of the 10 billion. It lends out only 9 billion. Okay, why? Because it needs to have a little bit of money in reserve. What if this rich person comes along and all of a sudden decides to buy a new, I'm trying to think of something that would cost $1 billion. A couple of houses and a couple of Lamborghinis. Okay, no, that would. No, that wouldn't get anywhere close to it, would it? A couple of very large houses and a whole stack of Lamborghinis worth $1 billion. But the idea is the rich person comes along into the bank one day and wants to withdraw $1 billion so that they can spend it on houses and ski resorts and cars. The bank needs to have some cash there tucked away just in case this person does that. And so instead of lending out all 10 billion, they lend out 9. Okay, now of course the actual process is much more complicated than this, but we don't need to make it any more complicated than this for the purpose of understanding the real world. That's the whole point. And if you want to understand this process in a greater degree of complexity, there's plenty of information out there, plenty of books, websites that go through this in painstaking levels of detail. So coming back to our simple explanation, the bank lends out $9 billion. What's going to happen? Well, that $9 billion will be loaned out to another customer of the ANZ Bank. And that customer who has borrowed the $9 billion, that money will be put in their bank account ready for spending. So what do we now have? Well, the rich person, they've still got their $10 billion in their bank account, but 9 of that $10 billion has been loaned out and deposited into the bank account, ready to be spent, but the bank account of someone else that banks at the ANZ. So now we have $19 billion worth of bank account deposits. So the banking system, in a sense, has received $10 billion because one of its customers have sold $10 billion worth of bonds. And by lending $9 billion out, the banking system has magically created $9 billion worth of new money in the form of a $9 billion bank account deposit. But the process continues. This customer who has loaned or borrowed the $9 billion, presumably they borrowed it to spend it, so that the customer who's now borrowed the $9 billion, they spend it and someone else earns that $9 billion. Now, the person who has just earned that $9 billion through the sale of maybe, some whatever, the sale of something worth $9 billion, that person will then have the $9 billion in their bank account. And let's just assume, and we've still got total new bank deposits of $10 billion. Sorry, $19 billion. The rich person's still got the 10 billion that they always had, but now the $9 billion is now in the bank account of a third person who sold something to the second person that borrowed the $9 billion via the ANZ Bank. So we've still got $19 billion worth of bank deposits. Now that third person who has earned the $9 billion by selling assets, maybe a house and some cars, whatever, to the second person, what are they going to do with the $9 billion? Well, let's assume, for simplicity, that they just keep it in their bank account, maybe for a rainy day. And they earn interest on that $9 billion, third person. But what's the bank going to do? Their bank, the third person's bank, what are they going to do with the $9 billion? They're going to lend it out. How much are they going to lend out? Let's assume in step 5, they lend out $8 billion. That $8 billion is loaned out to another customer of the whichever bank we're talking about now. The $8 billion is loaned out, is put into a bank account of the fourth person in this story. The fourth person takes the $8 billion, spends the money on something, and it's earned by the fifth person in this story. And so the $8 billion then settles into the bank account of the fifth person in this story. So what have we got now? We've got the original $10 billion. We've got the $9 billion, which is in the bank account of the third person, and we've got $8 billion in the bank account of the fifth person. What's going to happen to the 8 billion? It's going to be loaned out again. Well, 7 billion will be loaned out. And then we'll have $7 billion worth of new money. Through this process, what you can see is that when new money comes into the banking system, part of it is loaned out. That money is then spent and it settles into the bank account of someone else. When it settles into the bank account of someone else, part of that money is loaned out again. It is spent and it settles in the bank account of someone else. That money, once it's settled into the bank account of someone else, is loaned out again. So in a sense, the banking system is taking the $10 billion and lending it out multiple times, not just once, multiple times. That's how the fractional reserve banking system works. And this process that I'm describing is the credit creation process. Now, what is being created here in this process is new bank account deposits. And we know bank account deposits are money. So what happens, what the banking system actually does is it will take this $10 billion as new base money. That is new money entering the economy through an open market operation of the central bank. The banking system will take the 10 billion and lend out, say, 9. That $9 billion will be spent, earned by someone else, and settle into the bank account of that third person. The third person's not going to spend it by assumption. That $9 billion, 8 billion will be loaned out to the fourth person, and it just continues like that. And so as we go through this process, and I could have created steps 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and you're probably thinking, oh, thank the Lord he didn't. But I could have kept going. And what you would get is this process would just continue on and on and on, as long as there were willing customers to borrow money at each of the steps. All you need for this process to keep going is customers willing to borrow money. And so what you can see is we had new base money of $10 billion in the form of a new bank account deposit, but as the banks take this 10 billion and lend part of it out and then relend it and relend it and relend it, you get this is the credit creation process, and it creates a much larger amount of broad money, because broad money includes all of these bank account deposits. Base money doesn't include bank account deposits. So the new base money was the $10 billion, which was injected in the form of an open market operation. Now, yes, that $10 billion ended up as a bank account deposit, but because it was a bank account deposit created by a central bank transaction involving new money entering the economy, it's defined as base money. But then once the banking system lends this money out over and over again, it's the banking system which is then creating new bank account deposits and lending those deposits out over and over again. And so that is then the bank account deposits, which are part of this credit creation process. They are a type of broad money. So what I'm getting at here is, if the central bank creates $10 billion worth of new base money, when the banking system gets hold of this $10 billion and lends it out over and over and over again, they can multiply the $10 billion upwards and create a much larger amount of broad money. So the banking system, by lending this money out over and over again, could actually create new bank account deposits of possibly 40, 50, 60 billion dollars. Because remember what's happening here. Through this process, person number one, the rich individual, they've got $10 billion in their bank account. Now that money was 9 of that 10 billion was loaned out, but person number one, they've still got $10 billion in their bank account. That 9 of that 10 billion was loaned out, to person number two. Person number two spent that $9 billion and person number three earned it. And so now person number three has $9 billion in their bank account. So now we've got two people with a total of $19 billion in their bank accounts. Then what happened is person number four borrowed $8 billion of that $9 billion in person three's bank account. Person four borrowed $8 billion. They took the $8 billion and spent it, and person five earned that $8 billion. Now we've got, think about what's happening to the amount of money in bank accounts. Person one's got 10 billion, person three has got 9 billion, person five has got 8 billion. We've got a total of $27 billion worth of bank account deposits now. And bank account persons 1, 3, and 5, they can quite simply go into their bank and spend that total of $27 billion. So the credit creation process, this new money that is being created by people borrowing money that is deposited in other people's bank accounts and spending that money. That is true. But ultimately, the fact, another way of looking at the same process is that now, what I'm saying is that customers 2 and 4, they were responsible for borrowing money and creating and spending that money and creating new bank account deposits. So it is the process of borrowing money and spending it and having someone else earning that money that creates the new bank account deposit. And persons 1, 2, and 4 were responsible for borrowing money, spending it, and creating new money in the form of bank account deposits in the banking system. That's true. But still, persons 1, 3, and 5, they still have cash or money in their bank accounts to the tune of $27 billion. And so even though persons 2 and 4 created the new money, persons 1, 3, and 5 have that cash in their banking accounts just waiting to be spent. And so that is a lot of potential spending power, the $27 billion. I guess what I'm saying is that, what I'm trying to convey is that in this story, persons 2 and 4 borrowed money and spent it, and that created new money. But the fact is that persons 1, 3, and 5, they have in their banking account this additional money that has been created. And so we've got now $27 billion of potential of money sitting in bank accounts that can be spent. And yeah, if we continue this process on, it would be much more than 27 billion. So trying to avoid getting too complex here, but the basic idea is the central bank can put new money into the economy of, say, $10 billion. The banking system then takes that 10 billion, lends it out, it is spent, it comes back into the banking system. They lend it out again, this money, they lend it out for a second time, it is spent, it comes back in. They lend it out a third time, it's spent, it comes back in. And so the banking system can just create new money out of thin air through this lending process. And so this credit creation process, if it's very strong and it's allowed to actually play out like I've suggested, it can lead to very strong growth in the actual money supply. And if we've got a lot of money in the economy, that is potentially a lot of purchasing power, which can then fuel very strong inflation. And so, yeah, so that is the way that the credit creation process works. Now, with this does come back to quantitative easing, because what I indicated with quantitative easing is that is an increase in base money. Quantitative easing involves the central bank printing new money and purchasing bonds. So it's almost like this open market operation I described here. You've got new cash going into the banking system. But in the case of QE in the 2020s, we're talking about trillions of dollars of new money being injected into the banking system, trillions of dollars. What happens if we change 10 billion to, say, 8 trillion? I'm thinking of the US central bank. So we forget about the 10 billion and we change that number to 8 trillion. And we have this process play out on $8 trillion worth of money. Can you see the potential here? The 8 trillion could be loaned out, spent, redeposited into the banking system, and loaned out again, spent, redeposited into the banking system. If this credit creation process was allowed to play out on $8 trillion, you could see very, very strong inflation. So the central banks need to find a way to undertake quantitative easing and inject money into the banking system, but prevent this credit creation process from acting upon that new money. Okay, and there are ways of doing that. And I'll let you think about how that could possibly be done. Some of you may have already read about how central banks can prevent this credit creation process from acting on the new QE money that the US, that the European Central Bank, et cetera, have injected into their economies in recent years. Okay, but it's a very interesting process once you understand this. Certainly during a recession, the central bank may buy bonds and inject new money into the economy with the hope that the new money will stimulate new spending, new borrowing, new lending, and kick this process off. But QE is something different. When I suggest that during a recession, the central bank could actually inject more money into the economy to kickstart this process, I'm thinking of maybe sort of $50, $100 billion. I'm not thinking about 8 trillion. 8 trillion is a completely different ballgame. 8 trillion is roughly the amount of money the US central bank has printed in the last sort of handful of years under its QE policy. So once you start thinking about this, the potential of this credit creation process to act on 8 trillion, you can really see the potential danger that exists if the banking system takes this $8 trillion worth of QE money and is allowed to freely lend it all out. It could kick off this credit creation process, which could cause massive inflation. And so the central bank then needs to find a way of undertaking QE programs to the tune of $8 trillion, but at the same time prevent the money, the cash, the $8 trillion, which has been pushed into the economy, from participating in this credit creation process. Okay, so I'll leave it there and let you sort of absorb the difference between QE and the difference between these more moderate open market operations, and sort of understand this credit creation process and the concern that some economists have that this credit creation process could actually, if it acted upon the QE money, lead to very, very strong inflation.